Hi, everyone, and welcome to Dead to Rights, the podcast. I'm your host, Donna Carrick. I want to thank our listeners for joining us every week for our fantastic author interviews, short stories for our readers on the run, and valuable tips for writers that emerge out of the mouths of our venerable guests. We've got a great lineup scheduled over the next few weeks. On July 1st, our Canada Day interview is with former Canadian Parks Ranger and mystery author George Mercer. On July 8th, we'll be chatting with Jane Barnard, a Canadian crime writer. On July 15th, we'll bring you an interview with Perry Block, author of Nouveau Old, formerly Cute. On July 22nd, we'll be speaking with Iris Weichler, the author of Role Reversal and other self-help books. On July 29th, we'll be speaking with Jen Knox, author of Glass City and After the Gazebo. As for today, I'm delighted to bring you an interview with Canada's own crime writer, Denise Wilson, known as Dee to her friends. Before we get down to today's story, which will feature another great crime writer of Canada, our own Queen of Comedy, Melody Campbell, with her flash piece, July is Hell, I've got to bring you up to date on some news. Last week, today's author Dee Wilson launched her brand new business website, beop.ca. Both ends of the pencil offer services in professional editing and content writing by an established author, editor, and creative thinker. New and established authors, make sure your work is polished at the outset. Visit Dee Wilson at beop.ca and find out how both ends of the pencil can help make your work shine. Last week, we brought you our review of Trumpocracy, The Corruption of the American Republic by David Frum. It was a great book, and I highly recommend it, especially the Audible edition. This week, as promised, I want to tell you about a book that came out in December 2008, but due to the tragic recent death of its author, Anthony Bourdain, is experiencing a revival at the moment. Kitchen Confidential, Adventures in the Culinary Underbelly, is a rollicking and hysterically honest look at life in some of the hottest kitchens of our time. As our listeners know, my crazy schedule makes it hard to read quickly, so my preference is for Audible editions. I can listen to them when I'm walking or standing in line or anything like that. Bourdain's flagship work is available in Audible, masterfully presented in his own familiar voice. Tony is 3 parts pirate, 2 parts best buddy, and 5 parts culinary artist. Throughout his book, he is all parts raw, slicing through the veneer of the restaurant business to bring us a truly behind-the-swinging-doors look at life on fire. I was, of course, drawn to his work because of Tony's recent death by his own hand. I was particularly moved by Tony's suicide. I don't know why. I didn't know him, except, of course, for the public persona we all witnessed on our television sets. Public persona. That's a phrase I find fascinating, not the least because I've seen it far too often in cases like this. Large, lovable personalities. The type of characters who glow in the dark, who attract friends and followers seemingly without effort. People like the former owner of the company I work for in its previous incarnation, Mr. Harvey Southam of Southam, Inc. Harvey was always ready with a wide smile, a joke, a friendly word for any of our 350 employees, each of whom he knew on a first-name basis. He was young for a man at his level, handsome, gregarious, and personable to the max. In short, he was loved by all who knew him. When he took his life in 1991 in Toronto, many in the media refused, out of respect for his family, to report that it had been a suicide. How, I wondered, would honesty have been a mark of disrespect? But I guess, to many people, even today, mental illness, depression are marks of shame and weakness. The stigma remains. But how, I wondered, as someone who still to this day holds Harvey in the deepest of respect, is it a kindness to refuse to be honest? More importantly, how can our silence help anyone else who may be suffering? When Harvey loped in his gangly, tall way through our offices at 1450 Don Mills Road, he brought the sunshine with him. Everyone he passed would stop to chat. Not a single one of us had any idea of how he was suffering below the surface. Which brings me to remembering my own late sister Debbie, who took her own life so many years ago. Debbie was a 19-year-old willowy blonde with a crystalline soprano singing voice and a sense of mischief that preceded her. Everyone was instantly drawn to her laughter, her less than subtle sense of humor. She would joke, laugh. She was a lifelong fan of Carol Burnett. Her timing was stellar. You couldn't be in a room with her for more than a minute without breaking into raw laughter, and we all know how the world loves to laugh. There's an old saying, if you can make the people laugh, they will love you forever. But when that laughter hides a deep, dark mental illness, that laughter has an unforgiving shelf life. That's what I learned through losing my sister, and that's the memory drawn back to the surface of my mind by Tony Bourdain's recent passing. For fans of Parts Unknown, the exceptional CNN travelogue for foodies, starring Anthony Bourdain, this is a must-read. If you haven't already clapped your eyes or ears onto Kitchen Confidential, please do so today. You won't be sorry. At the moment on my Kindle, I'm thoroughly engaged in the latest novel by Stephen King, The Outsider. I'm finding it impossible to put down, even with my chock-a-block schedule. No doubt die-hard fans of Stephen King are already absorbing it. But for anyone not familiar with his excellent work, I'll bring you the goods on my reaction to this book next week. I also want to tell you about something I'll be digging into more deeply in an upcoming episode. A brand new book by author Caro Soules titled People Like Us. James Dubrow says that People Like Us is a beautifully written, intricate, haunting tale of how a Toronto woman's seemingly perfect life is completely upended and almost destroyed by sexual secrets involving her close friends and a 19-year-old gay street hustler. Nothing is as it appears to be in this profoundly moving coming-of-age novel. Caro Soules is a mature literary writer who in this subtle and haunting mystery is at the top of her game, and that's, as per James Dubrow, gay activist here in Toronto. But I definitely have this book, People Like Us, on my to-be-read list, and I'll bring you my own take on it over the next couple of weeks. And now, for our readers on the run, I bring you a short flash piece by my friend and fellow crime writer, Melody Campbell, titled, July is Hell. The Toronto Sun called Melody Campbell Canada's Queen of Comedy. Library Journal compared her to Janet Ivanovich. She has a commerce degree from Queen's University, but it didn't take well. Melody has shared a literary shortlist with Margaret Atwood and was seen lurking on the Amazon Top 50 bestseller list between Tom Clancy and Nora Roberts. She has over 200 publications, including 100 comedy credits, 40 short stories, and 14 novels. Melody has won the Derringer, the Arthur Ellis, and 8 more awards for crime fiction. She didn't even steal them. Her latest crime caper, The B Team, has just been released. Her previous one, The Bootlegger's Goddaughter, is a finalist for the 2018 Ontario Libraries Association's Golden Oak Award. One more thing, she's the former executive director of Crime Writers of Canada. July is Hell by Melody Campbell. I came back to the squad car with 2 coffees, both black. Bill was fanning himself with yesterday's newspaper. It's friggin' middle of the night, for Christ's sake. How can it still be so hot? I shrugged. July is hell. Always will be. I passed him the cup of Java. This job is hell, Bill muttered, leaning back in his seat. His thick body showed the wear and tear of 30 years on the job. He removed the lid carefully and threw it on the dash. Then he sighed. "I've got bad news for you." I was alert now, looking keen. His gray eyebrows creased into a frown. "You know that perp who raped those young girls back in March?" I nodded. Of course I knew. We had worked that case around the clock. Bill looked at me, then quickly looked away. "They got him off on a technicality." I cursed. We'd tracked him for weeks. We knew he was guilty, even if he had worn a balaclava. It was all in the way he reacted when we arrested him. You just know. That smile. "I know," Bill mumbled. "Damned lawyers. Time for me to get out of this hellhole. Do something positive with the rest of my life." "So, you're really going to retire then?" I asked. He nodded. "This case made up my mind. I'm finished with it." He looked over at me. "You have your own decisions to make. You're young. You sure you want to stay in this game?" I made a point of looking serious. "It's what I do, Bill. What I've always wanted to do." He shook his head. Then he took another sip. "Just be careful you don't get completely disillusioned like I am. It's not healthy. Letting scum like that go free on a technicality." He snorted in disgust. "He'll go to hell when he's dead," I said evenly. "You really believe that stuff?" Bill's voice was soft. "Well, you just go on believing it, Chris. Maybe it'll keep you sane." I doubt it, I thought to myself. I doubted it again when I took a knife to the perp's throat the next night. It took me only a few hours to track him down. That's the advantage of being a cop and a woman. You know how to find people, you know how to kill, and you know how to cover your tracks. He was going to hell all right, but I swear it was just as hot here. The end. And that has been July is Hell, a fabulous flash piece by Melody Campbell. I hope you've enjoyed the story, and now I'm going to bring you our interview with Denise Wilson.
Hello.
Good morning, Dee. It's Donna Carrick at Dead to Rights, and welcome to the show.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. For our listeners, this is Denise Wilson, who is the author of A Keeper's Truth and Got, which is a Gift of Travels, a series. And Denise is joining us here today to talk about her work and other aspects of the writing industry. So how are you this morning?
I'm good.
Yeah, it's a bright, sunny day out there.
Yeah, I live down on the water in Port Dalhousie. We built a house here about a year ago. And so I cannot complain. My view is spectacular.
Oh, that's terrific. Are you on the lake shore?
We're right on the water, yeah. We're on it's called Bayview, but it's right on the, like, literally I'm looking out my back window as I'm speaking to you and the waves are breaking against the back of my rock.
Oh, so that's terrific,
yeah. It's beautiful. We're right on Lake Ontario, yeah.
That is terrific, yes. I love
really
Lake Ontario.
I
used to live in...
at times, actually, but it's when the water hits really hard and it gets really rough, but when the storms come in, but most of the time it's beautiful.
Yeah, and we've got a beautiful sunny day out there today. I hear it's supposed to warm up finally. But I had a few questions for you, Denise, that relate to your work to begin with. I love titles. I'm a real lover of titles. And there's something really weird about the premise of A Keeper's Truth and Got. And I sense something really personal in No Apology for Being. One gets the sense that there is more of Dee in these works than you might care to admit. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about your characters, and especially in what way do they grow out of your own world experience?
Wow, these are loaded questions, aren't they?
They really are, yeah. Just break them down a little bit at a time. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'm definitely a lover of titles as well. I know a lot of authors have difficulty creating titles for their works. I don't. Now, whether they are good titles or bad titles is, I suppose, somewhat subjective, but I don't know. The titles just seem to be very, very clear to me quite early on in the writing process. A Keeper's Truth is probably the most personal from a perspective that it was, well, it was my first full novel. I had written several novels before that, but I had never fully completed one, and not to the extent of Keeper's Truth anyway. And it was definitely a book that was personal from a perspective that I had never really I hadn't dived that deep into really writing a story that could have so many layers as A Keeper's Truth does. I think a lot of my works prior to that were maybe a bit more superficial. So it was personal from that perspective. Where it probably is not personal is there's actually a lot of layers and a lot of things that take place in A Keeper's Truth that I don't know if I personally believe in. There's a lot of history I researched for the better part of almost a year and a half writing that book. I wrote the first draft, and then I put it aside and did a lot of research because there was a lot of things that were coming up in the story that, although they were things that were coming to my mind, were things that I really didn't know a lot about, and I had to sort of reach out and read a lot of other books to figure out what those premises were, what those threads.
I really love research. Can you give us an example of one of the things that you had to research for A Keeper's Truth?
Sure. I mean, this example is probably going to make me sound a little bit kooky, but for example, there was A Keeper's Truth had a lot to do with dreams. I'm sure lots of writers have the same experiences, but how A Keeper's Truth started was I woke up one morning and I had this very, very vivid dream. And it was a scene that takes place about 75% of the way through the book, the way it currently reads. But it was a very, very powerful scene. And it was one of those things that just, you get up. I have young kids, and my kids were a lot younger then. They were toddlers. And, I had two of the kids that had slept over that night. So I had a house full of 3-year-olds. And it was chaos. And it was one of those things that it just would not let go. By, I don't know, maybe a day later or 2 days later, I could not shake the dream. It was just so clear. The voices were clear. The characters were there. And I sat down and I thought, you know what, I need to just write this out. And prior to that, I was not planning to write a novel. It wasn't like I sat down, and I wasn't planning to write another one anyway. It wasn't a work in progress by any stretch. And I sat down and I started to write it. And the more I wrote it down, I would go to bed at night, and the more it would just sort of ferment in my head. And I would have, further dreams. The characters became even more vivid, and they'd have other conversations. And so, but they would start to have these conversations or the come up that I didn't really understand. And I know that's what makes me sound a little crazy, because I'm not a superstitious person, and I don't really believe in sort of magic and voodoo and all of that stuff. But,
yeah, I'm pretty pragmatic about those things myself. So, yeah.
But on the other hand, though, that's also what makes writing that type of stuff so fascinating to me, and I hope that comes off to a reader of my work as well, is because I'm very scientific. I'm all about research and facts and real knowledge. And so when I have these ideas for story threads that are really quite have elements of mythical or things that are beyond my understanding, they sort of make me uncomfortable.
I sort of know what you're talking about. I have an unpublished work called I Ching Ballet, and it involves a villain who is very fascinated with I Ching, sort of, which is a Chinese future telling sort of system. And so I had to research extensively on how I Ching works and what the belief system is. And do I believe that we can determine the future by a set of sticks? No, not really. But, the character believes it. So therefore I have to know a lot about it. So
Exactly. And so, and yet, as much as I'm not sure I believe, I am totally fascinated by a lot of the concepts that come up in A Keeper's Truth.
Mm-hmm.
So for those who don't know, or if you haven't, even read it, A Keeper's Truth, a lot of it's about a current day young woman who has experienced rape from the onset of the very first sentence, severe tragedy. Her husband has passed away, and they have a 4-year-old daughter. And she really feels quite inadequate to raise her child by herself. And it's all very sudden and very tragic. And especially she has a pretty rough childhood. So, having been just, married and have a child is for the first time in her life, she has some order.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really throws her for a loop. And in doing so, the grief opens a part of her that she, A, doesn't believe in, B, has no understanding of or concept of, and she realizes that she can see into people's souls. So she can, not everyone, but she mainly sees old souls. So the concept is that all of us, for the sake of the story anyway, all of us have souls. We are all reborn from a previous life. But there's old souls and then there's new souls. And old souls are people who their souls have lived various lives dating way back in history. Mm-hmm. And then obviously newer souls are the opposite of that. They're newer souls that maybe don't have as much background. Mm-hmm. But the idea is that none of us remember our souls. Or our souls do not, and it's on purpose. It's the way we are created so that, you have some experience in the past to go by. It's almost like a computer that's been shut down, but there's certain memories or certain things that are still there, but they're not clear to you, but they might help guide you in certain decisions you make or certain personality traits that you have. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, you don't really know what those are for good reason, so that you can, every new life, you can start anew. And the idea is that our souls are here to learn. They're here to learn with each lifetime the person that you want to be.
Which is really basically the study of Buddhism or Zen learning,
Absolutely.
What is your character's name in A Keeper's Truth?
The main character is Tess Morgan.
Okay.
And the gentleman, there's 2 gentlemen in that story, and Thomas and Bryce.
Thomas and Bryce and Tess Morgan. And Tess is, I guess, could be described as an empath in a way.
I guess, yeah. I actually, it's funny because I did a fair amount of research, but then there were certain things that I would stumble across that I actually intentionally said, whoa, I'm not going to read that. And I find that with a lot of my work, I do that because there's certain things that I need to know as the author to write it well, but then there's other things that I realize that the character does not know, and so I actually don't want to know.
Okay.
Because I can better feel for her perspective
and her sense of discovery, because the reader wants to be discovering along with the character. Yeah.
And so there are certain things when I'm researching that I go, as soon as I stumble across it, I go, whoa, wait a minute, stop. I don't want to know any more about that.
Yeah. Now, our listeners may not realize, but in 2017, A Keeper's Truth won the Kobo Best Emerging Canadian Author Award. So that's pretty prestigious and pretty important. Can you tell our listeners about your experience with Indigo and about what the Kobo Award has meant to you in pushing forward in your work?
Absolutely. Now, Kobo and Indigo are not...
They're not, no, they're not, yeah. They're
not
separate companies,
anymore,
yeah.
They were at one point. So I do have a background with Indigo, so I'm not too sure if that's what you're referencing. I've worked with Indigo for almost 19 years now.
Okay.
So, but that's separate from my writing.
Okay.
I'm a contract buyer, so I work with them on that. Yeah, Kobo, it was an amazing award, and for those who were at the ceremony, I'm sure would have their own stories with that, because my speech was absolutely insane. I didn't write a speech because there was no way I had ever thought that I would win the award.
There was
So
no
I
way
had
you were
actually
winning,
written.
Dee. There was no way. You were not going to win. But then, lo
But
and behold, you won.
it was crazy. Yeah, I had actually written congratulations Facebook post that I hadn't posted yet to the winners. So it was quite shocking. But yeah, that was, it was unexpected. It was something that was submitted by my publisher. I was just over the moon. I am still over the moon excited about it. It really, writing is very personal, and, I mean, you would know, and any writers know.
Mm-hmm.
We sort of live in this bubble to an
Yes.
extent. I mean, social media has made things much more open these days, but you still live within a bubble.
You
and your
do,
experience
yes.
and your story.
Your thoughts are your own. I mean, if you're a real writer, your thoughts are your own. And when we express them to ourselves first.
Yeah, and so I think because of that, and there's a lot of, or at least for me anyway, there's a lot of self-doubt in writing. There's a lot of, I have moments where I think, oh, this is genius and I love it and I've done a great job on whatever, a chapter or a sentence or, whatever.
Yes.
And then other times I go, oh my Lord, what am I doing?
What was I thinking?
What is that? Like seriously, that? I can't have anybody read that.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of, because you are in this bubble, there's not a lot of outside participation.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you get, to bring it back to the Kobo Award, what I'm trying to get at is, so when you get recognized for any kind of award or any kind of acknowledgement, it breaks that bubble a little bit, even just temporarily.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it makes you feel like you're part of a bigger picture for a while. And it makes you realize that other people have read your work, and other people in the industry even, not just readers.
Yes, yes. Yes, I ask a lot because I have a lot of authors among my network of friends who are award-winning authors, and I tend to ask them this question because, I'm really interested in how it impacts your future work, whether it adds an impetus or whether it... in some cases, it can cause self-doubt even more because how do you follow that,
I think it's like anything. It's a two-pronged fork. It really, on one hand, it motivates you because you feel that other people have recognized. And there was a lot of, I forget, don't quote me on the exact number, but I remember at the ceremony itself, I think they had said there was like some crazy thousands of submissions in each category. There was 3 categories. I won for genre fiction.
No pressure
and
here.
So, yeah, you hear that and you think, oh my gosh, thousands of submissions and they narrowed it down to my book? Like, wow. And so on one hand, you're very flattered and it motivates you to think that, okay, well maybe there are other people who think that I can do this and that, I have something to say and I say it well enough to, deserve that kind of recognition. But then on the other hand, you have part of you that always, or at least I do, I have always part of me that goes, oh God, when are they going to realize I'm a fraud?
Do you know you're not the first person? You're not the first person to say exactly that to me.
Several novels, and that's not really true. I do know what I'm doing, but you have moments, where you feel that way, and you think, oh my gosh, are they going to ask me for this money back? Are they going to strip me of this award? And then there's even part of you that kind of goes, well, oh my gosh, now there's pressure.
Yes.
Now there's an expectation. When I wrote A Keeper's Truth, it was purely for myself. I mean, I had no intention, even when I started it, writing a full novel and completing it. It never even entered my radar. And I definitely did not have publishing in mind or agents or any of that. And so from that perspective, it was definitely something personal. And so it does put a little bit of pressure on you because now...
What do you do for an encore?
Other people have an expectation. So So I'm actually lucky because I wrote Got before I ever even got A Keeper's Truth published.
Okay.
So I wrote Got just before A Keeper's Truth came out.
Okay. Now I have a question for you that I'm kind of skirting around because it's a very dark question. You grew up in St. Catharines, Ontario, and I'm going to ask the question, and I'll leave it to you to determine how much you want to answer, because I think you know where I'm going with this. One of the most horrific news stories ever to come out of Canadian news was a true life case that rocked us to the core back in the early 90s with Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, who were at that time living in St. Catharines. How aware, or when did you become aware of this case, and did it color any of your writing?
There's two sides of that. First, I'll say that I don't think it outwardly did, but I don't think any writer can ever legitimately say that things that happen in their past, in their childhood, or in their history don't in some way alter the way they write or the way certain characters think. But I think it's very subconsciously. I never sat down and it was a conscious thing. The other side of that coin of what I'll say is that I was in my late teens when that happened, and I lived right down the street, so it was extremely close to home. Both of the girls were in my brother's classes in school. And so it was a very, very personal thing. And I'll also mention, we built this house here. So I live literally across the street from where Paul Bernardo lived and where he did what he did.
I had no idea you were that close. I may not have asked the question
literally,
if I
look
had.
out my front window, I can see where it was. So anyway, it's right across the street. On the same road. And so we built this house we moved in a year ago. And when we looked at the land to buy, to build, that was one of the things that was really difficult for me, was because I grew up with that story and with, well, it wasn't a story, it was real life. And I grew up with the effects of that. And so it was actually really hard to even buy this land because of that. Those things affect you forever.
Yes, they do.
And although I don't remember a lot of details of it, I was young and have your own things on the go. I remember everyone being very afraid for a long time.
Yes, for a long time. For a long time.
In fact, now that my children go to the school down the street, and they walk, there's not a day that goes by that it doesn't at least enter my mind for a split second that my kids are walking by that property. Yeah. Or does it, and I see it, because I moved away from here when I was younger, and I've just moved back. I had a lot of years in between, so that I was not local. And so now I see things, or I hear things, or I see circumstances that come up in other parents of children my kids' age, and certain things where I know, like I can peg where that's coming from. Certain fears or certain comments that are made, about how, she's going to walk home alone. She's 2 minutes down the street from the school.
Yes. And our parents never would have thought of it. Now, I suspect that I'm...
Ever even come up.
No.
Why would a 12 and 15-year-old not walk home from school?
No, exactly.
Down the street. And so parents now, they'll say things, and although it isn't outwardly connected to that, I can see as sort of somewhat of an outsider coming back.
Yeah.
We'll walk away and my husband will be like, well, what was that all about?
Yes,
because he never grew up here. And I'll be like, I know exactly where that's coming from.
Yeah.
When you grow up with that type of fear, it does, leave a mark.
Now, I'm pretty sure I'm quite a bit older than you, and My parents had a house in Malvern, which is way out in the East End in Scarborough. And I was living with them at the time and working for Bell Canada. I was a very, very young woman. I probably should have been in school, not working. But I was working for Bell Canada. It was back in the day when anyone could get a job. And it was in the disco days. I don't even know if you know what they are. But I would meet my friends at the disco downtown. And because I didn't drive, I would have to take the TTC out to Shepherd and Markham. And one night, I guess it was around 11 p.m., I was on the bus, and a guy got on. I was alone on the bus, and I was sitting kind of near the driver, because that's what I used to do when I was traveling at night. And a guy got on and went and sat in the back of the bus, and I didn't think anything of it. I was reading my book because I didn't want to fall asleep and miss my stop. And at one point, the driver stopped the bus, and we were way out to the East End by this point. We must have been in Agincourt area. And he came to me and he whispered to me, "You don't get off the bus. You stay on the bus no matter what." So I stayed on the bus. We ended up out at the zoo. You know where that is, I'm sure. And he went to the guy and he said, "This is your stop. Get off." And the guy pretended that he'd fallen asleep and he had another stop and wanted to go back. And the driver said, "No, this is your stop. Get off." And I guess he had, in my mind now looking back, he'd probably seen this guy stalking young women before. And about a week after that incident is when the Toronto Argonauts cheerleader was killed in Agincourt. If you'll recall that. You may not recall that story. I think you may be too young. But that was put down to the Scarborough rapist, who we later learned was Paul Bernardo. And so these stories have always chilled me. They've always really chilled me. So I know what you're saying when you say that when you hear a parent taking extra precautions that may even seem kind of unreasonable, you know where they're coming from.
Well, yeah, and even though it's, 25 years later, those things are embedded in you.
Yes.
You know, those memories. So it's actually really quite ironic that you even asked me about Bernardo, mainly because we've never told our children. My kids knew nothing about it.
Okay.
Even when we moved here. And it was literally about 3 days ago, earlier this week, that my 12-year-old came home from school, and we all eat dinner together, so we sat down at the dinner table. And she says, "Somebody at school told me that we live across the street from a murderer."
Mm-hmm.
And my husband and I just sort of look at each other because we know exactly where this is going. And we said, "No, that's not. No, you do not." But anyway, make a long story short, we had her tell us exactly what her friends were telling her at school, and we obviously had to give I have two daughters. We had to give my kids enough information so that they understood what it is that they're being told.
Yeah.
But you know, my older one, her first question was, "Why didn't you tell us?" You know.
Well, because it would have colored your entire childhood.
Yeah, you know, and I said, "You know why? Because we moved here a year ago from a whole other city. It was a whole new change for them. They had only lived in the same house their entire lives. Our previous house we were in for 15 years. It was the first time they had ever moved. We moved an hour and change away from where we lived before. They didn't know a soul here other than we have some family here, but they didn't know any friends or anyone at school. My older daughter was actually starting high school 3 days after we moved in here, starting grade 9, which is hard enough,
yes,
you know, for somebody starting grade 9. And there was just so much change happening and so much going on that it was a very conscious decision, even when we bought the property and started building, that my husband and I made to never to discuss what happened across the street.
Well, I had no idea when I came up with this question, and I was reluctant to even ask it, but, you know, writers in the Toronto area have researched this particular case, most writers quite a bit, especially crime writers like myself. And So when I learned that you lived in St. Catharines, I wanted to ask the question, but I had no idea that it was so closely connected.
Well, first of all, the house is not there anymore. So,
No.
this is one of the things I had to make clear to my kids the other day.
Yes.
The land is not even there anymore. You have to understand the city or the police department. I'm not sure who would do that, but that whole entire area was gutted.
Yes.
They had to. They tore up everything over
Yeah.
there. So the existing house that is there now is relatively new. It's only been there within, I believe, the last 10 years. So it's not like anything is still there.
No.
It's gone. It is now other people's houses, and actually the young lady who lives there is in my daughter's class, so that's how some of this came about.
Okay. Now to get to get to a lighter note, because sorry for sorry for taking you down that rabbit hole, but you've recently signed with Hilary McMahon, VP of Westwood Creative Artists, and they're working with you on the Got series. And the series has a theme and a story. Well, of course, it has a theme and a story. I may have to edit such a inane conversation out, sorry. But what can you tell us about the characters and the situations in Book 1 of Got?
So Got is sort of our world altered. And so, do you have enough time for me to just give a tidbit of how I even came up with Got?
I sure do. Yeah.
Not something, or do you want me to just focus on the characters?
No. Tell us whatever you want to tell us about Got.
So, Got was created, or the way I came up with the premise of that was I was actually driving for work to Washington, D.C. for a conference. And my husband and kids decided to come with me and spend a few days. And so my kids were in the back and watching movies, and so I couldn't have the radio on. Anyone with young kids know what that's like. They can't hear the movie if you have the radio on, so it's silent. And the day before we left, my husband had an injury in hockey and was on pain meds, so he slept 9 out of 10-hour drive.
That's when you get your best writing done,
so it
right?
was let's just say it was a very sort of quiet, peaceful, introverted drive for me, driving the car. And the drive from Toronto to Washington is sort of back roads and a lot of on and off small highways and stuff. And it was June, so spring, and I was blown away by the amount of, and I know this sounds awful, but roadkill, dead animals on the side of the road, to the point where it hurt. I would pass these dozens and dozens of deer, and it was spring, so they're all out, and they get hit by cars, and there was just so much of it. And I do find myself, I have a bit of a connection to nature, at least I try to. And so it really, really bothered me, to the point where I started apologizing to each one that I passed. To myself, just quietly in my head, I am really sorry that, not that I hit it, but
that this happened to you. Yeah.
You had, you've had to die so that this road could be here for me to get to Washington. And I'm really sorry for that. And I kept finding I was apologizing. And so at one point, because, as a writer, we don't go anywhere without pen and paper, I pull out my notepad, and I'm trying to drive with one hand and
oh no,
write with the notepad on my lap on the other. And I was just writing down how it feels and I was like, okay, well, what would I do? How would I get to Washington if this road wasn't here? I mean, obviously I could fly or do other things, but, modern day transportation, this is how we get around.
Yeah.
And I started to think, well, man, what would this world be like if we didn't do this? If we didn't blow dynamite holes into sides of mountains and plow through forests, and we didn't, tear down, entire, acres of trees to run highways
If
through.
we let nature recover itself. Yeah.
Yeah, if we didn't do this, if we lived with nature instead of against nature.
Which is a very Canadian theme, I must say, as Ed
Oh, is
Grimley
it?
would say. It's a very Canadian way of thinking. Let me put it that way. And in terms of apologizing to the dead woodland creatures, as my husband and I call them, it sounds like something my husband would do.
I'm starting to realize really quick that this interview is going to make me sound like somebody who's a little bit off kilter. But I'm
I
really not.
love off kilter. I think most people expect their writers to be off kilter.
I'm really not. I'm very much like a business frame of mind. I'm very much an A plus, A equals, something.
Okay,
So,
we believe you, Dee. We believe you.
yeah. But it was just, and so I basically came up with that concept before I even like anything else. And that was sort of the way it started. Was I was like, okay, like what would this world be like without all this? How would I get around? And actually one of the very first things, if you don't mind me reading it.
No, please do.
So I'm just going to read you it's just one paragraph, and it's actually the opening of God. And my purpose for reading it is that this is actually one of the very first things I wrote. I wrote this before I even arrived at the hotel in Washington, and it never changed a single word from the published, or what will be the published version. In 1819, the madman of a tiny town in Bulgaria invented a machine to take him from point A to point B without moving a muscle. An ugly thing, the machine, not the man. All wires in a big old wooden crate filled with who knows what, but it worked. The most discerning thing about it was the mess of wires and mud-laced twine that wrapped around the head. It resembled a crown. Befitting, seeing this ingenious contraption would soon be prized by king and country. The madman called it a got, the gift of travel. Now, over 200 years later, gots are not only built, but born, and I, for one, do not consider it a gift.
Oh, very intriguing. I like that. So the gots are human at this point.
Yeah, and so my purpose behind reading that was because I truly believe, anyway, that pretty well the entire premise of God is in that one paragraph.
yes, it is. It is. It really is.
Is that I created that entire thing before I even got to Washington. So in the 8.5-hour drive.
I think some of the best works are they're conceived of during trips. I hear this from other authors, and I've certainly experienced it myself. I first started taking novel writing seriously during a trip to Kingston, of all places, with my family. I've got 3 children, but at the time we only had 2, and my husband and I decided that we were going to take a 3-day excursion to Kingston just for something to do. And we always book a hotel that has a pool because we're swimmers. We love to swim. We were really struck by the triple nature of Kingston. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the city, but there's the academia, there is the prison system, and there is the military educational system. And the 3 aspects pretty much dominate all of Kingston. And I just thought that was as a military brat myself, and I'd never lived in Kingston, but I thought that was just a fascinating way to build a city, And it got me thinking, and it got me thinking about a novel, which I never did complete, but it was the beginning of that road for me. And I've certainly heard this from other writers too, that travel seems to inspire something in us that kind of jogs us down that road,
For sure. For sure.
And
then I think where because I do have this, all of my stories tend to have this, I hate the word supernatural because it makes it sound so vampires, and it's not. But all my stories do have this sort of otherworldly sort of thread. They're very much rooted in the here and now and current day reality, but they do have that thread in them. And I think it's just because I find that aspect fascinating. And going back to the very first thing we talked about is I don't really necessarily believe in a lot of it, but I find it incredibly intriguing.
Yes, yes.
To think of the possibilities and to
Mm-hmm.
think that there's so much more out there than I know, or that I will ever know,
Yeah,
or
and
that
with
anyone,
such
for that
an
matter, will ever know.
intriguing body of work that is growing right in front of you, and it is very original. I mean, the themes are incredibly original. I'm really impressed with that. So I'm wondering who your favorite authors are and how they've influenced your work, because you're not writing run of the mill stuff here. It's quite different.
Yeah, which makes it hard to publish.
And yet when you have those niche readers, they're really going to enjoy it. You
You
know
know,
that, right?
it's one of those catch-22s. Is that everybody, publishing screams, unique. We want unique stories and unique characters and unique voices. Um,
But do they really?
but when you present them with that, people do get a little afraid,
Yeah.
because it's the unknown, and
Mm-hmm.
publishing is a business in a world of numbers, and so it's hard to understand how that is going to translate to sales,
Yeah.
and it becomes difficult. Don't get me wrong; I've had great experience with publishing. I'm not cutting that up in any way, shape, or form, and I have an awesome agent, and all of that is good. But I do see that.
Yeah, you see both sides of the unique parallel. But back to your favorite authors, though. Can you tell me who would have?
I would, if I had to pick one, by far my most sort of the author that most influenced me as a writer would probably be, and I'm going to apologize if she ever hears this, because I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce her last name, but it's Audrey Neffeninger.
Okay.
She wrote The Time Traveler's Wife,
Yes. Yes, I'm familiar with that.
which I think was published quite a few years ago now. I think that's been out for a good, I don't know, at least maybe 10, 15 years, if not more.
Time does indeed fly.
It's probably the one. I mean, I read books ferociously. I read a lot, and I tend to read books that I love for one reason or another. I read them over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And I've probably, again, I'm sounding like a crazy. I've probably read Time Traveler's Wife about 11 or 12 times.
Well, it's a great book, and it was a great movie too. I mean, it was it was quite offbeat. It was quite different. I don't think we should ever apologize for being offbeat or try to explain that away. I mean, you can be a sensible, down-to-earth family woman and businesswoman, and you can be all those things in your real life, but in your imagination, that's where we fly.
That's true.
And
I think The Time Traveler's Wife, for me, hit all the buttons.
Mm-hmm.
It is written spectacular in my mind. I think her writing is spot on, perfect in my mind.
Yeah.
The characters, to this day, anytime I sit down and write, her characters are the very first to come to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from my own, of course. Or
so it's really stayed
but,
with you, and I mean, I'm fascinated with what influences us. I really am. I've got one more question for you, and then we've got to wrap up for today. But I've promised our listeners that we'll always have a tip. Have you got a tip you can share with new writers in particular?
I'm known to say, write for yourself, always.
Yeah.
I've had some really bad health experiences the last 6 months, and the whole cliche of you don't know until you look death in the eye, what you're really all about,
Mm-hmm.
is quite true. It's a saying for a reason.
Yes.
And life is really too short to be writing for agents, publishers, even readers to a certain extent.
Yeah.
As writers or as authors, we spend at least, I don't know anybody who can write a book in anything less than 6 months or a year.
Yeah.
At least not a good one necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
And we spend sometimes years and years and years, surrounded by our characters in a story. And that's a long time to spend for someone else.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And fermenting those ideas. I mean, I've had an entire novella come out as automatic writing. You know what automatic writing is. It's not usual for me. I'm not a seat of the pants writer. I'm very much a planner, and I like to research and I like to know what I'm doing. But with the Noon God, the idea had fermented in my mind for the better part of 2 years, to the
Yeah.
point where I knew every character, I knew exactly what they were doing and why, and I knew how it would begin and how it would end. And so when I sat down to write, there was no need for outlines. There was no need for any of that. It just came out of the fingertips, you know? And I think that's what you're talking about when we spend so much time with our characters and our ideas. They have to at least be our own.
Yeah, you have to write for yourself. You have to write because it's your passion, and there's no other way that you'd like to spend your time,
Yeah, yeah.
your spare time.
That's right. Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly.
It's a hard gig. I will say that it's there is the business side of me that says that for the amount of hours and work that we put into writing, we as authors do deserve.
Yeah.
More. We deserve.
The rewards don't always bear scrutiny.
They don't.
No, at least not the financial rewards.
No, it's no get rich quick program.
It's really not.
It's
really not.
And there's a misconception amongst readers, by the way, with that. A lot of times, someone, will be out at a whatever social event, and someone will say to my husband, "Oh, what do you and your wife do?" And he'll say what he does, and he'll say, "Oh, my wife is a writer. She's an author." And and they go on and on and on to make it sound like you're this,
yeah,
famous millionaire. Okay, I sit in front of a computer all day typing my, little heart and soul out onto a computer. Nobody recognizes it at all, generally.
No.
And if I had to rely on just my writing, I'm not sure my kids would be fed.
I know mine wouldn't. I mean, I make no secret of the fact that I've had a full-time job my whole life. Ever since I was 16, I've worked full-time, and I have no apologies for it. There was a time when I was younger when I used to daydream about ditching the whole work thing, and becoming a full-time writer, which of course is a lot of work too if people don't realize it. But now in my more august self, I kind of recognize that my being able to support myself and my family my whole life has also supported my art. I've been free to write exactly how I want to write. I've been free to network with authors from all over and get their insights, which is something not a lot of people have the time or the money to do.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so I value having been able to make a living outside of my art and been free to pursue my art the way I want.
Exactly. But at the core of it, it's do it for you.
Yeah.
Do it because it's a story that you cannot shake, and even though it sounds like the way I've explained, sort of, God or A Keeper's Truth, or even No Apology for Being that I'm working on now, sounds like they, come fast or easy, like, and I suppose in some ways those general premise of God in particular, since I created the general premise in just hours, sounds like it's fast and easy, but those are things that go back and you marinate them for months and months and months. And I'm like you, I'm a diehard planner. Everything is well documented.
Yes.
No Apology for Being. I was actually just chuckling, talking on the phone with a writer friend of mine, someone that we both know, by the way, but the other day, and I had commented on how I had just done this random check in my Scrivener program to see how many words I had accumulated for No Apology for Being, and I was at like 84,600 something words. What's funny about that is I haven't actually written the story. I haven't started writing No Apology for Being.
So this is just outline and material
I have scenes laid out. I have dozens and dozens of scenes laid out. I have pages upon pages, obviously, of character profiles. I have tons of research. I have the entire plot figured out from starting to finish. I know exactly what's going to happen. It's one of the reasons also that I firmly believe my stories don't have any saggy middles. They are so well planned out and
Yep.
have a good flow. But yeah, and so, and don't get me wrong, I'm not necessarily saying all that's a good thing. In fact, her words to me were, "You have 80-something thousand words and you haven't written it yet? What the hell are you doing?"
But you know what? You know what? This is almost a divide, and you hear this from athletes, and you hear it from artists in almost every form of art, musicians, painters. When you make it look easy, it's usually because of the multitude of hours of work behind it. So that when you're ready to write as a writer, and if it starts to just flow and come into being in a very organic way, it's usually because you've put so many hours of research and documentation and planning and outlining in behind it. So now you're free to just tell your story. You don't have to wonder where it's going.
That's a really important point, and it's actually something that any newbie writers especially should try to incorporate into their writing program, or how they plan and process, is that I think personally that when you have all the research done and you've got your characters really well vetted, and I don't mean just sitting down and writing general things. I mean literally staring out the window. I've spent countless hours and days and days and days and days just staring out the window and writing notes on, exactly how my character, each individual character, thinks, and
Yes.
where they're coming from, and their history, their childhood, and experiences they've had that marked them.
Yeah.
And all of these things are all noted, and it doesn't necessarily mean that, out of the 80-something thousand words that I already have written, a large percentage of that will never ever find its way into the story.
No.
Verbatim,
No.
it won't.
But for you, it's mental background.
But
Yeah.
I need to know it.
Yes.
As the writer, and then to me, what that means is that when I sit down, which I'm literally at the point where I'm going to, and I need to start writing. So I will be writing that in the next upcoming week or two. I have to start. And but when I sit down to write it, I now can focus on the writing itself. I can focus on the words. I can focus on the flow and the pace and the emotion that the characters feel. And
Yeah.
I can get real down into the nitty gritty on the just pure technology of it, of how it all kind of comes together, instead of trying to figure out
Flounder.
as I'm going,
Instead of floundering as you write. Yeah.
where it's going, or what I've missed, or if I've tied up a loose end, or this, that, and the other. I don't ever think that stuff, because I did all that before I wrote it.
Yeah. I'm going to call that tip number 2, because I think in some ways that's, write for yourself is really, really important. But do your work too. Do your research, do your planning. I'm a big believer in that. I mean, there are times when a story does just come out of your mind. There's no question. But for the most part, the best stories are well planned and well researched, and at least that's my view. So. Yeah. Denise, stay with us for just a moment. I'm going to sign off now, but I want to thank you for coming to Dead to Rights and for all of your great insights and telling us about your creative process, which is another one of those cliches that's a cliche because it's important. People want to know about the creative process. They really do, So thank you for all of that.
Thank you.
I want to thank Dee Wilson for joining us today on Dead to Rights. You can find Dead to Rights, the podcast, at deadtorights.ca or at our podcast Facebook page. Our Twitter handle is @deadtorightspod. We'd love to hear from you at carrickpublishing.com or at our Carrick Publishing Facebook page. You can find me, Donna Carrick, on Twitter at Donna_Carrick or at my website, donnacarrick.com. My husband, Alec, can be found at Alex_Carrick or at his website, alexcarrick.com. Join us next week when we'll be speaking with George Mercer, a retired Canadian Parks Ranger and a mystery author. Our Dead to Rights theme song is Eyes of Gold, composed and performed by Ted Carrick, who also brought us all original story scoring music. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week when we'll bring you our review of The Outsider by Stephen King.
A dusty road, a man alone. His vital signs go on hold. And I don't know what you've been told, but the years have turned my eyes gold. And I told you what you told me, we'd never be in the same boat for free. Yet it rides